Swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
So when the Varsity Blues Admissions Scandal broke, I was in the middle of being really, really busy with some things for work. We suddenly had a crisis where I had to take over a bunch of other classes. I found myself just completely swamped from beginning to end. And so although people kept asking me about it, I didn't really have the opportunity to say much about it publicly. And, to be honest, a lot of what was said was not, I think, substantively much different than the kinds of things I might have said. Now, one of the reasons that I didn't do it, of course, is I was so busy, and being so busy, as those of you who follow this netcast know, is I had to produce a lot of materials for this class I'm taking over in Vietnam. So I probably spent an hour to 2 hours a day just recording to get that ready. And one complaint that I had, which is probably the complaint I have more than any other, was a complaint about sound quality. And again, people said, you need to get a pop filter. So once I was done with that and could take a couple days break, I decided, well, it's time to get myself a pop filter. So here it is. I feel very awkward about it. I don't think I've ever used one before. Maybe I've been interviewed on the radio and other places like that before. So maybe there was one there and I just didn't know it. So I feel very awkward. Like there's a dinner plate here sitting in front of me. I don't know what to do with it. And when you're maybe on stage and you don't know where to put your hands, I feel that way about this. So let me know if this looks distracting to you, because I might simply change where I put it, or the orientation at which I'm sitting, so that I don't feel like I'm kind of peering at you over this thing. Or maybe just soon it'll become second nature and I'll forget I even have it here. Okay. But as I mentioned, I was really busy at the time. But I did want to talk about the Varsity Blues Scandal, because I wanted to deal with a couple of things that have kept coming up. So the first thing is, let's just talk a little bit about what is the Varsity Blues Scandal. And it's basically big. We had a lot of arrests and indictments based around people getting in to a few colleges and universities in a kind of sleazy and illegal way. And there are different elements to this, everything from using a charity to launder the money and so forth and so on, to their celebrities involved, and questions about, why would someone spend millions of dollars to get their children into, on some cases, schools that don't really have great reputations, kind of have reputations for being to being schools that rich kids who can't perform go to. I'm not going to name the schools, but if you know the reputations of different higher institutions of higher education, you'll recognize the one particularly I'm talking about. But there's all sorts of elements like this, but there are two issues. And so a lot of the public debate about this was basically people who go to very elite schools complaining that their potential slot was taken up by someone else, and other people talking about it, general practices, ways of getting your children into those schools, and how some of them are slipperier than others. But I want to bring a different perspective to it, and that perspective is replying to two questions that I've gotten a lot of. One was people have asked, really, how bad is the problem? I mean, we have a bunch of arrests and high-profile arrests, but how widespread is the problem? And the other one is a rhetorical question. That is like, well, you know, if the whole system is rigged against me, what hope do I have? So I want to address the first question before I address the second one. But I want to be clear, when I'm addressing this, I'm really assuming that most of my audience are people who don't already have either a legacy where they and their parents went to, you know, an Ivy League school or one of the Seven Sisters, or a very sort of elite school for wealthy and high performers, or that they are themselves not super wealthy and thus hoping to send their children to one of these super elite schools. I'm going to assume that most of you are not in that camp. If you are in that camp, many of the people have said a lot of interesting and I think correct things about the scandal. So first of all, the question of how widespread it is. And the truth is, it's impossible to know. And there's a couple of reasons. There are basically two, I mean, there are lots of criminal elements to this, but there's basically two methods that they use to get their children in. One method was to bribe test administrators, basically, to give their children inflated test scores. And in many ways, that happens outside of the university. So when we get a test score from, you know, an ACT score, SAT score, we just assume that the test score that we received is valid and accurate. And there's, you know, if every one of those was false, we wouldn't have a way of knowing about it. My guess is that My guess is that if there were really, really rampant, you know, parents paying, test administrators thousands of dollars to inflate these scores artificially, that if that were really happening, we would have seen a lot more of it before now, and that it's a very uncommon practice. But there's no way for sure of knowing that. And so I'm going to assume that it's very rare, but that's an assumption. That should be clear that it's just an assumption. The other one was parents paying, usually coaches or people in sports, but other sort of university administrators, to essentially let their kid in to create a kind of make work project on a sports team. Now, now I want to differentiate this from something which schools do all the time, which is not illegal. And that is, it's a little sleazy, but, you know, if you are wealthy and you want to give $20 million to endow a building, or to create a named chair for a professor, or to create a collection in the library or something along those lines, schools will happily slap your name on it and often let your idiot child into their school. And that is sleazy for sure. But the truth is, I don't really think that that's that much of a problem, because first of all, that's done pretty publicly. I mean, your name is on the thing. Everyone knows that this happened. And so the school is openly saying, you know, they might not literally say this is a quid pro quo, their child is an idiot, but there is a sense of that. And aside from that, everyone gets to use the thing. If you're endowing a chair for a professor, that professor is not an individual tutor for the student. That professor's salary is now being paid by this, or the building that they've built is now a facility that not just that student, but all the other students then, and presumably forward, can use. And so if a school says, it makes the judgment call, yes, we know it hurts our reputation that we, let this person in despite the fact that they probably didn't meet the more stringent requirements that most of our students do, in exchange for providing us with this money. But we think that this money is so much that it's worth the hit to our reputation. I mean, I don't think that's unreasonable. Like I said, it feels a little bit sleazy. But the truth is, if you went to college, you probably lived in a building with someone's name on it. You probably went to school in buildings with people's names on them. And those names, sometimes they were just philanthropists who wanted to philanthropists who just want their name on something. But sometimes they get a little something out of that, like, their niece who might not have been the brightest bulb got in anyway. That stuff happens all the time. Again, how common is that? Well, it's way more expensive to do that than the methods these guys were using. So I think it's very uncommon just because of the cost of it. The cost to buy a building for a university is pretty high. So I don't think that happens very often. And when that happens, it's such a special case. I think it would be wrong to think, well, you're taking someone else's slot. I don't think that's true. So I want to differentiate that from what we saw happening here. Okay, that's a different animal than saying, I'm going to pay this coach or this other university administrator personally let the person in. And that's, I think, the big difference. So say, for example, that I said, okay, my child is, wouldn't be able to get into your school normally, but I will buy you a new basketball court. All right, fine. The school can make that judgment call. They get the new basketball court, not just while the 4 years or probably fewer that student is there, will that basketball court be in use, but for many years after that. And of course, the money that you would normally use to build a new basketball court, you don't need to use for that anymore. You can tear down the old basketball court and build something more necessary there. You can, whatever you're going to do. Whereas if I approach the coach and say, I will give you personally $20,000 if you make a fake basketball position for my child, that's a thing that no one benefits from except for that child and that that coach or whoever is taking the bribe. And I think that is in not just in degree but in type very different from the other kind of exchange, because no one gets that. That's a kind of personal bribe. And we saw a lot of personal bribery. And we saw kind of people trying to justify it, saying, well, I used some of that money I would have used for that to provide scholarships to other people. You're really stretching at this point. Clearly it's give me money and I will do a private thing for you. And not only would that be illegal, but I think the level of sleaziness is really beyond that, because you can't, with a straight face, make an argument that everyone is benefiting from that, whereas you can make the argument for the other one. So, in that case, how widespread is that? Well, the truth is, as far as I know, it is not widespread. But the question is, how would we know? So one of my positions here at Troy University is I'm the chairman of the Athletic Advisory Committee, which means that I've been appointed to do some oversight over athletics, particularly in the case of academics. We make sure that they're not scheduling too many away games and taking the athletes away, and make sure they're not, we have all sorts of rules to make sure that they, don't bring the students back after an all-night game at 6:30 a.m. and then expect them to be in class an hour and a half later, fresh-faced, that they count that as being, that they treat that as if they've taken that day away from them. We have all sorts of things that we do. But that's done from a very high macro level. And so even though I and the rest of the committee have a degree of oversight over athletics, one thing I've literally never looked for are fake athletes. Now, one thing that we do keep our eyes open for, and we don't have a problem with it, Troy, just to be clear, but a lot of schools do, are fake students, people who are athletes but aren't really students, right? We've seen that again and again and again in higher ed, where there'll be people who are supposedly students, but they're just students in name. They're not really taking classes in any real way. A local school had a real scandal with that about a decade ago here in Alabama. Though not the University of Alabama, another major Alabama university had a big problem with that. Kind of fake students, right? But it never occurred to me, frankly, before Varsity Blues to worry about fake athletes, real students who are pretending to be athletes. So it's, first of all, not something we would look for. But second, even if I were then called on to check and make sure that this is the case, I don't know how I could tell. What do I mean by that? Well, in any sport, you're going to have a lot of people who are just riding the bench. You want to make sure that you never have to forfeit a game because you can't, fill out the team. And so because of that, on any team, there are going to be people who you never see out on the court or out on the field or, whatever the sport is. They're almost never there. Or you're waiting for them to develop as their talent. And so they're just going to be, again, riding the bench while they are, learning the ropes as freshmen or sophomores. And so it would be very difficult to tell the difference between someone who was legitimately there, they're not playing the sport publicly because they're either developing their talents under the coach's, tutelage, or they're barely under the level of the other people. And so if we need, if someone gets injured or whatever, they're going to be bumped up, but we just need them on the bench. I don't know how to tell the difference between that and someone who secretly they paid $10,000 for and is riding the bench also, right? The difference between someone who is there because the coach took a bribe and not, very hard to tell unless you have like email paper trails or a cooperating witness or the kinds of things that the FBI had. Be very difficult. So my sense is that it's not common, because I feel like if it were common, we would have heard about it before this huge sting operation. But it's possible that it could be much more common than we ever thought it was. So the short version of that is I don't think it's that common, but it could be. Okay. You don't want to get too doctrinaire about that. That could split open something where over the next decade we find that this has been going on for a long, long time and no one knew about it. Okay. So this is the thing which probably is not common, but could be very hard to police unless people are leaving a paper trail. So why should I not just give up? Like, why shouldn't I just say, like, well, the whole system is rigged against me? And this is what I've heard a lot of. The whole system is rigged against me. And I really want to discourage people from thinking that way. The truth is that we basically have these two methods, right, of getting in. One is the inflated test scores. And it is possible that your slot was taken up by someone who cheated or had an inflated test score. That's true. The other one being this sort of fake athletic position. But the fake athletic position is, unless you wanted to go to that particular school and have that, be on the crew team of that school, unless that was what you were going for, or, to be the kicker on their football team. And the kicker, it turns out, was, brought in for a bribe or whatever the thing is. Unless you're in that particular case, you have to be a very particular person before that would actually affect your slot. We're assuming that there's a slot for someone, that we're operating off of a strict quota system here, which I think is not exactly right, but we'll take it as a generalization. But the other side of this is we're talking about a very small handful number of schools. And I'm saying this not because I want to say, well, there's only a few bad apples, but rather, in most cases, if you can't get into a particular school, you're more than happy to go to a different school that is of the same caliber of the one school you want to go to. We're talking, it's a very interesting situation where either you have children who frankly couldn't have cut it probably in those schools, whose parents just wanted to get them in because it's the only opportunity they can get them. There's more to it than that, but others have talked about that at length. Or it could be that, or it's simply the parents for some reason fixate on a particular school. That school, it's got to be that school. I think USC seems to have been that, literally paying millions of dollars to get into USC. I'm not, without trying to denigrate USC, I don't see why any rational person would do that, regardless of ethical considerations. There are plenty of other schools that are better than USC, or just as good, that you could consider going to. which actually gets at a kind of bigger issue for the average person. Look, unless you specifically want to go to one specific elite school, the chances that this is going to take your slot is slim to none. Because as I always told my children, and I think they've done this, you go where they pay you. One thing growing up as I did, and then, my children having to, I have a professor's salary, so it's not that high. I can't afford to send them to elite schools on my own. But aside from that, when a school's offering you money to do something, they're investing in you. And I always told my children, you go where they pay you. And so even if you can get into a school that is a better school, somehow it's ranked better in some way, you still go to the school that's going to pay you to go to it, because that school is invested in you and invested in your success. Now, not everyone's going to get a scholarship. So not every one out there. Some of you are on are average. And if you're average, but you want to go to school for some reason, hey, look, there's nothing wrong with being average. Most people are. That's what average means, right? Or you're above average, but you're just above average enough, not quite enough to get the kind of scholarship that you would need to really offset the cost of going to school. Listen, that is the case for most people. So even if you end up going to a school where they're not going to pay you to go, they're not going to pay you to be an athlete or to be in the band or whatever, you still can know that you can go to almost any school and get a similar outcome. Because, of course, and I've said this before, one of the dirty secrets of higher ed is that study after study has shown it doesn't matter where you go to school. What matters is what you do when you go there. And so when people say, yeah, but all these really famous and elite and important people went to these famous elite schools, yeah, because they already came from very wealthy families and went to very fancy prep schools. These are definitely people who were born on third base and sauntered their way into home. This is why you so often see famous dropouts from Ivy League schools. It's not that dropping out helps you. Dropping out doesn't help you at all. It's that they were already so embedded in, having everything that they needed to succeed, having just being able to wrangle together hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in investment just from, the parents of your friends, before you ever step foot on a college campus, makes that kind of thing possible. But if that same kind of person had gone to a state school, community college even, right? If that same kind of person had gone there, they would have had the same advantages. By the same token, that kid who's like, I really want to go to some elite Ivy League school or some other elite school, but their slot was taken by someone else, and they end up going to a different school, maybe one which is ranked lower in some way, that person is still going to succeed. They're still going to succeed because in the end of the day, they're the kind of person that everyone else wants to get to know. They're the go-getters. They're the ones who are able to come from behind, who are able to come out of difficult circumstances and succeed. And so, they're going to be a success no matter where they go. And that's the truth. So for those of you who really are really eager to do well in school, but you've heard about all this and you're really frustrated and you think the system's rigged against me, now I can't succeed. You know what? You might not end up going to the school that you had your heart set on, but don't let that worry you. Wherever you go, whether you go there because they pay you, which is what I tell my kids, or you go there for whatever other reason, just succeed and excel there. And let this bunch of losers who spent hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to get their kids into school, let them have, well, in this case, their day in court. But if those who didn't get caught, let them have their degree, because they're going to end up exactly where they're going to end up before anyway.